This is Cowboy Chronicles, where the dust of the Old West carries stories of grit, love, and the untamed hearts that built the frontier. If you love tales of cowboys, strong women, and the kind of love that is forged in fire, you are exactly where you belong. They called her a freak. They crossed the street when they saw her coming. The women whispered. The men looked right through her. Because Nora Vaughn had arms that could bend iron, and in 1883, that was enough to make a woman invisible. She ran the only forge for 30 miles, but she had not heard a kind word in 2 years. Not until a stranger rode into town on a gray horse with a secret in his past and a woman's wedding ring around his neck. He looked at her, and he did not flinch. He looked at her, and he said 5 words that changed everything. But what she did not know was that the man following him was already in town, and he had plans for both of them. This story will remind you that being different is not the same as being broken, and sometimes all it takes is one person brave enough to see you clearly to change the course of your whole life. If this story moves you, leave a comment and tell me which moment hit you the hardest. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community. Now, settle in. This one is worth the ride.
The hammer fell on red-hot iron, and Nora Vaughn wondered whether she was shaping a horseshoe or hammering herself into something this town would never want. Dawn had barely cracked the ridge of the Sierra Nevada, but the forge was already alive. Orange light spilled from the open doors like something bleeding. The smell of burning coal hung thick in the still mountain air, mixing with the sharp bite of horse sweat and heated metal. Sparks scattered across the packed dirt floor each time the hammer struck, tiny orange stars born and dying in the same breath. Nora brought the hammer down again. The iron sang beneath it. She could feel the vibration travel up through her wrist, her forearm, her shoulder, settling somewhere deep in her chest where it joined the rhythm that had been her companion since she was old enough to hold a tool. Strike, turn, strike, turn. The horseshoe was taking shape under her hands, glowing cherry red against the dark surface of the anvil. Colfax, California sat in the foothills like a town that had forgotten why it existed. The gold rush had come and gone 20 years back, leaving behind empty mine shafts and broken promises. Now the town clung to cattle ranching and timber, a single dusty main street lined with a saloon, a general store, a half-built church with bare rafters like the ribs of some great beast. And at the far end, as far from the center of town as a business could sit and still be in it, Nora's forge. She was 22 years old, 5 feet 8 inches of broad shoulders, corded arms, and calloused hands. Her dark blonde hair was pulled back in a braid that hung between her shoulder blades, practical and tight, because loose hair near a forge was a good way to catch fire. Her green eyes stayed fixed on the iron as she worked, reading the color the way other women read scripture. Orange meant pliable. White meant too hot. Dark red meant you had already lost your chance. The horseshoe hissed when she plunged it into the water barrel. Steam rose in a cloud that smelled like iron and rain. She set the finished shoe on the rack and wiped her forearm across her brow, leaving a streak of soot across her cheekbone. The morning was already warm, and her sleeveless work shirt was damp with sweat, her arms bare and glistening in the forge light. Muscles moved beneath her skin like water over smooth stone, defined and powerful in a way that made the women of Colfax cross the street when they saw her coming. Nora had work to do. The Wilson wagon needed a new axle pin. The church builders needed nails. And she was running low on flour and coffee, which meant a trip to the general store. She banked the forge fire, hung her leather apron on the hook by the door, and walked up the main street toward Harlow's general store. The morning sun was climbing fast, turning the dust to gold. A few early risers nodded to her from porches. Most looked away. Inside the store, the air smelled like dried beans, tobacco, and wood polish. Nora moved through the aisles quickly, gathering what she needed: flour, coffee, a tin of lard, a new file for her rasp. She heard Ruth Henderson before she saw her. The woman's voice had a way of carrying, sharp and deliberate, like she aimed her words the way a man aimed a rifle. "Look at those arms. More man than my husband ever was." Two young women standing near the fabric bolts covered their mouths. One let out a small, strangled laugh. Nora did not turn around. She set the flour sack on the counter and waited for the shopkeeper to tally her bill. Her knuckles went white around the burlap. She did not realize she was gripping it that hard until she was outside and her fingers ached. Ruth Henderson stood near the door in a high-collared dress, buttoned to her chin despite the July heat. Her face was pinched and certain, the face of a woman who had made judgment into a hobby. But as Nora passed her, something happened that she almost missed. The shop door opened behind them both, and a heavy male boot step thudded on the wooden floor. Ruth flinched, just barely. Just for a heartbeat. Her hand rose toward her throat, fingers brushing the collar of that high-necked dress, and then dropped back to her side. Nora noticed. She did not understand. Not yet. She walked back to the forge with her supplies tucked under one arm and her jaw set tight. The words burned in her chest like hot coals, the way they always did, settling in beside all the other words that had accumulated over the years. Mannish, unnatural, wrong. She had heard them all so many times they should have lost their sting by now. But words were like horseshoe nails. They were small, but they held things in place. That evening, Nora sat alone in the cabin her father had built when they first came to Colfax 15 years ago. The place was small and spare, a bed in one corner, a cast-iron stove, a table with 2 chairs, though she had not had a guest in longer than she could remember. She ate beans and cornbread from a tin plate, sitting in the chair that faced the door. The other chair, her father's chair, sat empty across from her. She had never moved it, could not bring herself to. Her father's voice came to her then, the way it did on quiet evenings when the loneliness pressed in close. She could hear him as clearly as if he were sitting across the table, coughing into his handkerchief, his eyes fierce, even as his body failed him. "You have got better hands for this work than any man I ever trained. Do not let anyone take that from you." But that was not the whole memory. The whole memory included the morning after, the morning she tried not to think about. She had woken before dawn and gone to start the forge, and she had found him on the path between the cabin and the shop, face down in the dirt, still wearing his work boots. His body had finally surrendered what his stubbornness would not. He had dragged himself out to work because he did not believe she could hold the customers on her own. He had been too sick to stand, but he had been more afraid of her failing than of dying. And in the end, he had done both. Nora set down her fork. The cabin was dark now, the last light dying in the windows. She did not cry. She had trained that out of herself years ago, wrung it out like water from a rag until there was nothing left. But she sat in the darkness longer than she needed to before she lit the lamp. Outside, the Sierra Nevada mountains rose black against the stars, and the night was quiet, except for the distant sound of the creek running over rocks. Then, faint but growing, hoofbeats on the packed dirt road. Coming from the East Pass, steady and unhurried. Nobody rode into Colfax after dark unless they were running from something or riding toward trouble. Nora turned down her lamp and listened. Tyler Quinn had been riding for 3 weeks straight, not because he loved the scenery, but because every time he stopped too long, he started seeing Martha Crane's bruised face in his dreams, and his own bloody hands beside it. The gray gelding beneath him was trail-worn, but patient, picking his way down the mountain road in the early morning light with the careful steps of a horse that had learned to trust his rider even when the path was uncertain. Tyler sat easy in the saddle, the way a man sits when he has spent most of his life on horseback, loose through the hips, steady through the spine, moving with the animal rather than against it. Colfax appeared below him as the road curved around a stand of sugar pines. It was not much of a town, a single street, a cluster of buildings that looked like they had been dropped there by accident and never picked up again. A saloon with its doors shut against the morning chill. A general store. A church that was more skeleton than building, its bare rafters reaching for a god who had not seen fit to provide a roof yet. And at the far end of the street, where the road turned to dirt, and the town gave way to the mountain, a forge. Its doors were open, and the rhythmic sound of hammer on iron rang through the still air, steady as a heartbeat. Tyler needed a blacksmith. His horse had thrown a shoe 5 miles back on a stretch of rocky trail, and the remaining 3 were worn down to nubs. He had been told in Sacramento that Broken Creek Ranch north of Colfax might be hiring hands. But first, the horse. He rode toward the sound. The forge was larger than he expected, built of stone and timber with a wide double door that let the heat escape and the light pour in. Inside, the orange glow of the fire painted everything in shades of amber and shadow. The blacksmith stood with her back to him, bringing a hammer down on a piece of glowing metal with the kind of precision that came from years of practice. Tyler dismounted and looped his reins over the hitching post, watching her work. She was tall for a woman, broad through the shoulders. Her arms were bare below the sleeves of a work shirt that had been cut short, and the muscles there were not the lean, understated kind that could be hidden beneath fabric. They were the real thing, thick and defined, built by years of swinging a hammer and working a bellows. Sweat glistened on her skin, and when she turned the iron with her tongs, the motion was fluid and sure. Tyler did not see a woman with unnatural muscles, which was what he imagined most people in this town saw. He saw a craftsman at work. He saw economy of movement, the way every strike served a purpose, no wasted energy, no hesitation. He saw someone who knew their trade down to the bone. It reminded him of his mother. She had split wood, mended fences, hauled water, and run a homestead alone, while his father drank himself useless in town. Her hands had been calloused too. Her shoulders had been strong, and Tyler had loved her for it with a fierceness that still ached in his chest, even now, 3 years after pneumonia had taken her. He cleared his throat. "Morning. I am looking for the blacksmith." Horse threw a shoe about 5 miles back. She turned. Green eyes, steady and direct, met his from across the forge. She was younger than he expected. Maybe his age, maybe a year or 2 less. Dark blonde hair in a tight braid, soot across one high cheekbone. Her expression was guarded, braced, like a person waiting to be hit. "You found her," she said. Tyler watched her watch him. He understood that she was waiting for something. The surprise, the fumbling, the look of disgust or discomfort that men gave women who did not fit the mold they had built for them. He simply nodded, led his horse forward. His horse. "Name is Tyler Quinn. I appreciate you seeing to it. I know it is early yet." "I have been up since before dawn," she said, wiping her hands on her leather apron. She moved to examine the horse's hoof, lifting it with practiced ease. The gelding stood calm for her. Animals usually knew when they were in competent hands. "You have come a fair distance," she said, inspecting the remaining shoes. "These are worn down considerable." "From Colorado. Looking for work at one of the ranches hereabouts. Fellow in Sacramento said Broken Creek might be hiring." She nodded and set down the hoof. "Broken Creek is about 8 miles north. Follow the creek road past the mill. Hank Morrison runs it. Fair man." She selected a shoe from her rack and gathered her tools. Tyler watched her work. The way she heated the metal, read its color, shaped it with strikes so precise they might have been counted. She was good. Better than good. His father had been a farrier before the drink took his skill along with everything else, and Tyler had spent enough time around forges to know quality when he saw it. "Good work," he said. "My father was a farrier. I know what to look for." She glanced up at him. Something flickered across her face. Too quick to name. Then she went back to driving nails. 3 strikes per nail, clean and even. When she finished, Tyler paid her from his worn leather purse. $2 for the shoe and the work. He gathered his reins and swung into the saddle. As he settled his weight, something shifted beneath his shirt. A glint of gold caught the morning light. A ring on a leather cord around his neck, small and simple. A woman's wedding band. He saw the blacksmith's eyes drop to it, saw her expression tighten just barely, before she looked away. Tyler touched the brim of his hat. "Miss Vaughn, I thank you." He turned the gelding north toward Broken Creek Road. Before he cleared the edge of town, he did what he always did. He scanned the road behind him, a quick sweep of the tree line, the rooftops, the spaces between buildings where a man could stand without being seen. It was the kind of thing a person did without thinking when they had been hunted. The road was empty. The mountains rose silent on either side. Tyler rode on, and behind him, Nora Vaughn set down her hammer and realized her hands were trembling. Not from fatigue, but because for the first time in 2 years, someone had looked her in the eye without flinching. The half-broke stallion reared against the lead rope, its front hooves slashing toward Nora's head, and she had exactly half a second to decide. Dodge or hold. She held. Her boots dug into the packed dirt floor of the forge yard as the horse came up, 1,200 pounds of muscle and bad temper rising against the sky. She threw her weight sideways, shoulder braced against the animal's flank, and pushed. The stallion's hooves came down 2 inches from her left boot, close enough that she felt the air move against her ankle. Then Tyler Quinn was there. He grabbed the halter with both hands and pulled the horse's head down, his voice dropping into that low, steady murmur that Nora had heard him use with the other horses, the sound a man makes when he is trying to convince something wild that the world is not as dangerous as it seems. "Easy now. Easy. You are all right. Nobody here is going to hurt you." The stallion blew hard through its nostrils, sides heaving, eyes white-rimmed. But it stopped fighting. Tyler held the halter and stroked the animal's neck, his hand moving in slow circles, and gradually the tension drained from the horse's body like water from a cracked bucket. Nora straightened up. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, but her hands were steady. They were always steady. That was the one thing she could count on. "I have seen 2 men try that and still get kicked," Tyler said. The grin that spread across his face was the first real smile she had seen from him. Not the polite, guarded expression he wore like a hat, but something genuine that reached his eyes and changed the shape of his whole face. "You held him alone." "He is not the worst horse I have handled," Nora said, though in truth the stallion was close. "Bring him into the shade. I will start with the other 3 and come back to him when he is settled." It had been 2 weeks since Tyler Quinn rode into Colfax, and true to his word, he had gotten the job at Broken Creek Ranch. Now he stood in her forge yard with 4 horses that needed full sets of shoes sent by Hank Morrison with instructions to stay and help if she would have him. Nora had hesitated when he asked. She always worked alone, had done so since her father died. But 4 full sets was a full day's work, and having someone who knew horses to hold them steady would make it faster and safer, especially with that devil of a stallion in the string. "You know how to handle them," she said. It was not a question. She had watched him with the gray gelding and with the Broken Creek stock, and she knew competence when she saw it. "I do. I will not get in your way." They fell into a rhythm that surprised her. Tyler held each horse, speaking to it in that low, calm voice, while Nora measured, heated, shaped, and nailed. Between horses, they talked. Not the forced, uncomfortable kind of talking that happened when 2 strangers were stuck together with nothing in common. This was different. Easy. Natural. Words coming and going like the tide, sometimes flowing, sometimes pulling back into comfortable silence. Tyler told her about growing up in Colorado, a small town in the mountains, not so different from Colfax. His parents had a homestead where his father kept horses and his mother kept everything else running. He talked about learning to ride before he could read, about breaking colts in a round pen with his father watching from the fence. But then the story jumped. One moment he was talking about his parents' homestead, and the next he was saying, "After I left," and the space between those two things was a closed door. Nora heard it. She recognized it. She had her own closed doors. She did not push. "What about you?" Tyler asked as Nora shaped a shoe for the third horse, the iron glowing orange beneath her hammer. "You grow up here in Colfax." "My parents brought me here when I was 7. My father saw opportunity in being the only smith in town. My mother was not so sure, but she followed him anyway." Nora plunged the hot shoe into the water barrel. Steam hissed and rose. "That is what women did." "Your mother's still around." "Died when I was 12. Fever. After that, it was just me and my father. He taught me everything." She fitted the shoe against the horse's hoof, checking the fit. "Said I had better hands for it than most men he had ever known." "He was right about that," Tyler said. Nora drove the nails home, 3 strikes per nail, the sound ringing sharp and clean in the afternoon air. "When he got sick, everyone said I should sell the business, said I should go work as a seamstress or a laundress, something proper for a woman." "But you kept it." "I kept it. And the town has been divided between needing my services and disapproving of me ever since." Tyler was quiet for a moment. Then he said simply, "Their loss." The words settled into Nora's chest like a coal that had not yet decided whether to burn or warm. They were finishing the second horse when Ruth Henderson walked past on the far side of the street, arm in arm with the minister's wife. Ruth's voice carried across the distance with the precision of a woman who had spent decades perfecting the art of being overheard. "Poor man probably does not know what kind of woman she is. Someone ought to warn him before he gets too comfortable." Nora's jaw tightened. She kept her eyes on her work, driving a nail with more force than it needed. The ring of the hammer sounded angry even to her own ears. Tyler said nothing. He did not look at Ruth Henderson. He did not offer words of comfort or outrage. He simply looked at Nora, held her gaze for a long, steady moment, and then turned back to the horse he was holding. It was, Nora thought, exactly the right thing. Not because silence was enough, but because his eyes said everything his mouth did not. "I heard that. I do not agree with a word of it, and I am still here." They worked through the afternoon. The sun moved across the sky and the shadows lengthened. Nora found herself noticing things about Tyler that she tried not to notice. The way the muscles in his forearms flexed when he held a restless horse. The sound of his laugh, low and warm, when one of the horses lifted his hat. The patience in his hands. During a water break, Tyler pulled off his hat and tipped the canteen over his head. The water ran down his face and neck, and as he bent to set the canteen down, the leather cord around his neck shifted. The ring slipped free of his shirt collar and hung in the open air, catching the afternoon light. A woman's gold wedding band, simple and smooth. Nora saw it clearly this time, her chest constricted, a quick, involuntary tightening that she could not blame on exertion. Tyler noticed her looking. He tucked the ring back beneath his shirt without comment, but something in his expression changed. A shadow crossed his face, there and gone like a cloud passing over the sun. Neither of them spoke about it. When the last horse was shod and the day's work was done, Tyler paid her from the ranch account and gathered the lead ropes. He swung into his saddle and looked down at her with an expression that made Nora's breath catch in a way she did not like and could not stop. "Would you mind if I stopped by sometime? Not for work, just to talk." Nora's first instinct was to say no. Her first instinct was always to say no, because no was safe, and yes was a door that could slam shut on your fingers. But something about the earnest hope in Tyler's gray-blue eyes cut through her defenses like a hot knife through leather. "I would not mind that," she said. His smile was like sunrise. She watched him ride away with the 4 horses trailing behind, and she stood in the doorway of her forge until he disappeared around the bend. Then she went inside and sat on the bench where they had taken their water break, and she pressed her palms flat against her knees to stop them shaking. That night, alone in her cabin, she could not stop thinking about the ring. Not who it belonged to. Not whether Tyler was married or widowed or something else entirely. Those were the practical questions, the questions a sensible woman would ask. But the question that kept circling in Nora's mind was simpler and more painful. Does he already belong to someone else? Because if he did, then the warmth she had been feeling, the crack in the armor she had spent years building, was just another way the world was going to hurt her. And she had been hurt enough. She told herself it did not matter whose ring it was or what it meant. She told herself she did not care. And she knew, the way you know when iron has gone too hot, when the color shifts from orange to white, that she was lying. Tyler knew he should leave Colfax before it was too late, before Virgil Crane tracked him here, and before he fell any further in love with a woman he had no right to love. August settled over the Sierra Nevada foothills like a heavy hand. The days were long and brutally hot, the kind of heat that pressed against you from all sides and turned the mountain valleys into ovens. Tyler worked the Broken Creek cattle from dawn to dusk, pushing herds through narrow passes where the dust rose so thick it caked in the creases of his neck and turned his sweat to mud. The ranch was good work, honest work. Hank Morrison ran a tight operation, but treated his hands fair, and the land itself was beautiful in the way that wild, unforgiving country is always beautiful. Granite peaks rising sharp against skies so blue they hurt to look at. Pine forests that smelled like church and solitude. Creeks running cold and fast over smooth rocks, the water clear enough to see the bottom 10 feet down. Tyler had been drifting since Colorado, moving from ranch to ranch, never staying long enough for anyone to know his name or ask about his past. But Broken Creek was different. The work fit him, the land fit him. And 8 miles south, in a forge at the end of a dusty main street, there was a woman who made him want to stay in one place for the first time in 3 years. That scared him more than Virgil Crane ever had. He was pushing a dozen head through a draw one afternoon when a young horse stumbled on the slope. The animal went down sideways, and a ranch hand named Pete Garza's leg caught underneath. Pete hollered. The horse thrashed, trying to right itself, and each time it moved, Pete screamed louder. Tyler was off his own horse before he thought about it. He grabbed the downed animal's saddle with both hands and wrenched it sideways with a force that surprised even him, lifting the horse's weight just enough for Pete to drag his leg free. The horse scrambled to its feet and bolted. Pete lay on the ground, breathing hard, his face white with pain but his leg intact. "Lord Almighty, Quinn," Pete said when he could speak. "You pulled that animal off me like you were trying to kill it." The words hit Tyler like a fist. He let go of the saddle horn he had been gripping and looked down at his hands. They were shaking. Those hands had nearly killed a man. They had beaten Virgil Crane's face until the bone cracked beneath the skin, had not stopped until Martha Crane had grabbed his arm and screamed his name. And the worst part, the part that woke Tyler in the dark hours of the night with his heart hammering and his sheets soaked with sweat, was that in the moment, it had felt right. Not just justified, right. Like his fists had been made for exactly that purpose. He walked away from Pete without answering. That night in the bunkhouse, he sat on his bunk and stared at his hands for a long time. Then he reached under the mattress and pulled out the bottle of whiskey he kept there. Took a pull. Felt the burn slide down his throat and settle in his stomach, blunting the edges of everything. He knew what he was doing. He knew what it meant. His father, Emmett Quinn, had done the same thing. Started with a pull after a hard day, then a pull after any day, then a pull before the day started, and another at noon, and another at supper. And by the time Tyler was 12 years old, his father had stopped being a man and started being a weather pattern. Clear mornings that turned to storms by evening, and you learned to read the clouds or you got caught in the rain. Tyler capped the bottle and shoved it back under the mattress. He was not his father. He told himself that every day. He was not sure how many more days he could keep believing it. He started visiting the forge in the late afternoons, when his work at Broken Creek was done and the day was cooling toward evening. Sometimes he came with a piece of tack that needed mending or a question about a horse's shoe. But more and more, he came just to be near Nora. She did not make it easy. She was guarded, careful, like a person who had been burned enough times to be suspicious of warmth. But Tyler was patient. Patience was the one gift his mother had given him. The ability to wait for something to come to you instead of grabbing for it. One afternoon, he noticed that the strap on her leather work apron was frayed nearly through. The next time he visited, he brought a piece of good bridle leather, tanned, soft, and supple, and left it on the workbench without a word. Nora found it that evening. She stood holding the leather, running her thumb over its smooth surface, and something in her face changed. A softening that she would have denied if anyone had pointed it out. But Tyler saw it, and he understood. It was not the gift that mattered. It was the noticing. Someone had seen something she needed before she asked for it. That was the first crack. The weeks turned and the cracks widened. Tyler helped her shoe a horse for the Wilsons. She showed him how to repair a broken wagon spring. They sat on the bench outside the forge and talked while the mountain air cooled around them, and the sky turned from blue to purple to black. Tyler told her about the ranch, about the cattle and the horses and the hands who rode them, about the foreman's gruff ways and the quality of the grass in the high meadows, and the way the sunsets looked from the ridge above Broken Creek, like someone had spilled a bucket of paint across the sky. Nora told him things she had never told anyone, about how she sometimes felt like she was living in the wrong skin, about the loneliness that came not from being alone, but from being surrounded by people who refused to see her, about the way silence could be louder than any insult. "When they call me mannish," she said one evening, her voice low and careful, "it is not the word that hurts. It is that they think it should hurt. Like telling me I am strong is the same as telling me I am broken." Tyler's father had once told him in one of those rare sober moments that were more painful than the drunk ones, that some people spend their whole lives being afraid of the wrong things. Tyler had not understood it then. He was beginning to understand it now. One evening, when the fire outside the forge had burned down to embers and the stars were starting to show themselves above the mountains, Nora asked the question she had been carrying for weeks. Her voice was steady, but Tyler could see the tension in her jaw, the way her hands gripped her knees. "The ring around your neck. Whose is it?" Tyler went very still. The ember light played across his face, turning his features to copper and shadow. He could feel the ring against his chest, warm from his body heat, a small circle of gold that weighed more than any object he had ever carried. He could lie. He had been lying to everyone since Colorado about who he was, where he came from, why he was always looking over his shoulder. One more lie would cost him nothing. But looking at Nora in the fading light, her bare arms catching the glow of the embers, soot smudged across one cheek, her green eyes watching him with a steadiness that asked for truth and nothing else, he found that he could not. "A woman named Martha Crane," he said slowly. "Her husband beat her. Bad. Regular. The kind of beating that breaks bones and splits skin, and does not stop until the man behind it gets tired." He paused. The words came hard, dragged up from somewhere deep. "I saw it happen. I went in, and I beat him. Worse than he had beaten her. Damn near killed him." The embers popped. A shower of sparks rose into the dark. "She gave me the ring before I left, pressed it into my hand and said, 'So you remember why you did it.'" Nora was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her question was not the one Tyler expected. "Do you remember why you did it? Or do you remember how it felt?" The accuracy of it took his breath. She had reached past the story and found the thing hiding behind it, the thing he had not told anyone, the thing he barely admitted to himself in the dark hours when sleep would not come. "Both," he said. His voice dropped to nearly nothing. "And that is what scares me." The silence between them was not empty. It was full the way a room is full of smoke after a fire, dense and present, and impossible to ignore. Nora said, "My father used to say good iron is not afraid of the fire. It needs the fire to take its shape." Tyler looked at her. Really looked. Not the quick, polite glances of social interaction, but the long, unguarded kind of looking that strips away pretense and leaves two people standing in whatever truth is left. She was beautiful. Not the way magazines or parlor paintings defined beauty, not delicate or soft or yielding, beautiful the way a mountain is beautiful. The way a well-forged blade is beautiful, powerful and precise and unapologetically itself. The words came out before he could stop them, barely a whisper, almost to himself, as if saying them any louder might shatter whatever fragile thing was forming between them. "Strong is beautiful on you." Nora's hands went still on her knees. In 22 years, no one had ever called her beautiful. Handsome, once or twice, in the way people say it about well-built furniture or a particularly fine horse. But beautiful, and connected to her strength rather than offered in spite of it, that was entirely new. She felt something crack inside her chest. Not break, crack. Like the first fracture in a cast iron mold before it splits open and reveals the shape that has been forming in the dark. "That will be $2 for the shoe work," she said, her voice coming out rougher than she intended. It was all she could think to say. The only words her mouth could form while her heart was doing something it had forgotten how to do. Tyler smiled. A small, knowing smile that said he understood exactly why she had changed the subject. He paid her. He gathered his reins. He rode away. Nora sat on the bench outside her forge for a long time after he left. Her hands would not stop trembling. The stars turned overhead and the mountain air turned cold and she did not move. "Strong is beautiful on you." The words repeated in her mind like the ringing of a hammer on iron, over and over, shaping something. Back at Broken Creek, Tyler unsaddled his horse and rubbed it down by the light of a lantern. Then he went to the bunkhouse and sat on his bunk. He could still feel the warmth of the ember light, could still see Nora's face, could still hear himself saying those words, words he had not planned, had not rehearsed, had not even known were inside him until they fell out. He was falling in love with her. And she deserved better than a man who solved his problems with his fists and steadied his nerves with liquor. He reached under the mattress, pulled out the whiskey bottle, took a long pull, stared at the ceiling. In Silver Falls, Colorado, a man with a scar running from temple to jaw was buying a drink for the postmaster and asking real casual if any mail had gone west to California lately, to a little mountain town called Colfax. Nora stood before the mirror in the green dress and wondered when the last time was that she had tried to be someone other than herself. Then remembered. Every day, for 22 years. The dress was new, deep green cotton, the color of pine forests on the mountainsides, with a fitted bodice and a full skirt that moved when she walked. She had bought it with money saved over months, walking into Sarah Jane's dress shop on a Tuesday afternoon when she knew the store would be empty, standing stiff and awkward, while Sarah Jane measured and pinned and chattered about fabric and fit. The sleeves were 3/4 length. They showed her forearms, the thick cords of muscle, the calluses, the small white scars from years of sparks and hot iron. Nora picked up the shawl she had laid out on the bed, held it against her shoulders. It would cover her arms, make her look more like the other women who would be at the harvest dance tonight. Softer, smaller, more acceptable. She put it on, took it off, put it on again, took it off, and dropped it on the bed. Not because she was confident, because she was defiant. If Tyler Quinn wanted to take her to the dance, then he got all of her. The muscles, the calluses, the shoulders wider than half the men in Colfax. All of it, or nothing. September had come to the Sierra Nevada with golden light and cool evenings that smelled of turning leaves and wood smoke. The harvest dance was an annual tradition in Colfax, held in the community hall on the first Saturday after the crops were in. Everyone came. Ranch families from 20 miles around, miners from the claims upriver, townspeople in their Sunday best. It was the social event of the year, and Nora had not attended since she was 16. That last time, she had gone alone, wearing a dress of her mother's that did not fit right across the shoulders. Billy Cooper had asked her to dance, and before she could answer, his friends had pulled him away, laughing and asking if he needed his woman to protect him from trouble. Nora had walked home in the dark with the laughter ringing in her ears, and had sworn she would never go back. But Tyler had asked her, and he had not asked casually or carelessly. He had stood in the doorway of the forge, hat in hand, and said please, had said he wanted the town to see them together, had said the word courting, and her heart had hammered so hard against her ribs that she was surprised he could not hear it. A knock at the cabin door. Nora smoothed the front of her dress, took one last look in the mirror, and opened it. Tyler stood on her porch in clean black trousers, a white shirt, and a vest that brought out the blue in his gray eyes. His hair was combed. He smelled like soap and something faintly spicy she could not identify. His hat was in his hand. When he saw her, he stopped. Just stopped. His mouth opened, and nothing came out for a count of 3. "Nora," he said. "Lord have mercy. You clean up well yourself," she said, and meant it. He offered his arm. She took it. They walked together through the cooling evening air toward the community hall, and Nora could hear the music already. Fiddles and guitars playing a Virginia reel, the sound spilling out of the open windows like light. The hall was packed. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting golden light over the dancers whirling across the pine plank floor. The smell of pine wood and spilled whiskey mixed with the scent of fresh bread and roasted meat from the tables along the wall. Cowboys in their best shirts spun ranch girls in calico, their boots stomping out a rhythm on the boards. Conversations died as Nora and Tyler entered. She felt the weight of every eye in the room turning toward them. Ruth Henderson stood near the refreshment table, her mouth open. Billy Cooper was by the wall with a glass of whiskey, and Nora saw his eyes go wide. Tyler seemed not to notice any of it. He led Nora straight to the dance floor as a waltz began, taking her in his arms with a confidence that left no room for doubt. His right hand settled at her waist, and she felt the warmth of his palm through the fabric. "You know how to waltz," he said. "My father taught me. Said every woman should know, even if she spent her days covered in soot. Smart man." They danced. His hand at her waist felt the muscles move beneath the fabric. Her hand on his shoulder felt the coiled strength there. They moved together with an ease that surprised them both, turning and stepping in time with the music as if they had practiced this 100 times instead of never. Nora became aware, gradually, that the stares had changed. People were not looking at her with the usual mixture of pity and disgust. Some of the young women were whispering to each other, and their expressions were not mocking but curious. A few men nodded at Tyler, the kind of nod that said they respected his choice. When the waltz ended, Tyler kept her hand. "Another?" he asked. They danced 3 more. By the time they stopped for cider, Nora's cheeks were flushed and her heart was lighter than it had been in years. Mr. Wilson came over to shake Tyler's hand. Sarah Jane appeared at Nora's elbow, grinning like a cat that had gotten into the cream, asking questions about Tyler that Nora pretended to find annoying. During a break between dances, Nora's gaze drifted across the room and found Ruth Henderson standing near the far wall. Billy Cooper was at a table nearby, drunk and getting louder. He slammed his hand down on the table to emphasize some point, and the crack of his palm on wood cut through the music. Ruth Henderson went pale. She took a step backward, her hand rising to her throat, fingers touching the high collar of her dress. It was the gesture of a woman who had been trained to flinch by years of sudden violence, the instinctive bracing against a blow that might or might not be coming. Nora saw it. filed it away, did not understand it yet. The evening rolled on. More dancing, more cider, more of the warm, golden feeling of being included in something she had always watched from outside, and then Billy Cooper ruined it. And then Billy. He caught Tyler in his doorway as they were stepping outside for air. Billy was deep in the whiskey, his face red, his words slurring at the edges, but still sharp enough to cut. "You know what she is," Billy said, planting himself in Tyler's path. "She ain't a woman. She is a damned ox someone put in a dress." Tyler went very still. Nora, standing just behind him in the doorway, saw the change come over his body. His shoulders squared, his right hand closed into a fist. And his expression, the expression she had seen only once before when he told her about beating Virgil Crane, settled over his features like a mask. The darkness, the part of him that wanted to destroy. "Say one more word about her," Tyler said, his voice so low and controlled it was more frightening than shouting, "and I will forget that I'm trying to be a better man." Billy's courage collapsed. He stumbled backward, nearly tripping over his own boots, and retreated into the crowd without another word. Tyler stood in the doorway, breathing hard, his fist unclenched slowly, finger by finger, as if he were prying it open by force. Nora watched him from 2 feet away. She had seen both things. Tyler defending her, standing between her and cruelty without hesitation, and the violence he carried inside him like a loaded gun, cocked and ready, needing only the slightest pressure to fire. She was simultaneously moved and frightened, and she understood with a clarity that cut through the warm haze of the evening that loving Tyler Quinn would never be simple. They walked outside. The night air was cool against her flushed skin. Stars filled the sky in such numbers that they seemed to press down on the mountains. The music from the hall was muffled now, a distant heartbeat. Tyler stopped walking, turned to face her. His expression was open, vulnerable, stripped of the darkness that had been there moments before. "I am sorry you had to see that," he said. "I am not sorry," Nora said. "I am not sorry that you would stand up for me. But I saw your face, Tyler. I saw what was in it." He looked at the ground. "I know. It scares me. It scares me too." They stood there for a long moment, the space between them charged with everything they had not said and everything they had. Then Tyler reached out and touched her face. His palm was rough with calluses that matched her own, and his touch was so careful, so gentle, that it made her chest ache. He kissed her, not dramatically, not like the heroes in the dime novels that Sarah Jane kept hidden under her sewing table. His lips brushed hers, tentative, asking a question. Nora answered it. She gripped the front of his shirt with both hands, her strong fingers twisting the fabric, and pulled him closer. The kiss deepened into something that made them both tremble, standing under the vast expanse of stars, while the music played on inside. When they finally broke apart, Tyler pressed his forehead against hers and breathed her name like a prayer. They walked back to Nora's cabin hand in hand, and Tyler left her at the door with one more kiss, gentle and sweet. She watched him ride away in the starlight, and for the first time in her life, Nora Vaughn felt beautiful. She slept deeply that night, dreamless and warm. The next morning, when Nora opened the forge, she found something on her anvil that turned the warmth to ice. A woman's gold wedding ring, scratched and bent, as if someone had torn it from a finger by force. It was not the ring Tyler wore around his neck. That one was smooth and whole. This one was damaged, ruined. Beside it, scratched into the iron surface of the anvil with a knife point, were 2 words, "Found you." Nora did not show Tyler the ring or the scratched words. Instead, she folded them into a leather pouch, shoved it beneath her mattress, and fired the forge hotter than she had all summer. Because she needed to hit something before she hit someone. The hammer rang against the anvil with a fury that had nothing to do with the work. She was making nails. Simple, mindless work that let her hands move on their own while her mind raced. Someone had been inside her forge, someone who knew about Tyler, someone who knew about Martha Crane and her ring, someone who had taken or copied that ring and left it as a message, a declaration of war scratched into the iron with a blade. Found you. By mid-morning, Nora had made her decision. She closed the forge early, something she never did, and walked to Sarah Jane's dress shop on the main street. The shop was small and warm, smelling of fabric sizing and lavender sachets, and Sarah Jane was stitching a hem when Nora came in and closed the door behind her. "I need your help," Nora said. She told Sarah Jane everything. The ring on Tyler's neck, his confession about Martha Crane and Virgil Crane and the beating that had sent him running west, and now this, the damaged ring on her anvil, the words carved into the iron. Sarah Jane listened without interrupting. When Nora finished, Sarah Jane set down her sewing and said, "We need to know what we are dealing with. I will help you write a letter to the postmaster in Silver Falls, Colorado. We can ask about Tyler Quinn and any warrants or legal troubles." They composed the letter together, Sarah Jane's neat handwriting filling the page with careful questions. They posted it that afternoon. The mail coach ran twice a week between Colfax and Sacramento, and from Sacramento it would go east by rail. 2 weeks each way, maybe 3. A ticking clock that Nora could do nothing to speed up. Meanwhile, she examined the ring she had found on the anvil. Tyler's ring, the one he wore around his neck, was smooth gold, well cared for. This one was scratched deeply, the band bent at an angle as if someone had wrenched it from a hand by force, not a copy. This was a woman's ring that had been taken, not given, which meant whoever left it had some connection to Martha Crane, or to her husband. Nora's blood went cold. 2 days later, a stranger rode into Colfax. He came from the east, the same direction Tyler had come from months before. But everything else about him was different. He rode a tall chestnut horse that was groomed to a shine. His clothes were clean and well-fitted. He wore a dark coat despite the September warmth, and his hat was new. He tied his horse at the saloon hitching post and walked inside like a man who expected to be welcomed wherever he went. His name, he told the bartender, was Virgil Crane. He was a stock detective out of Colorado, tracking a fugitive who had fled west after a violent assault. He was polite. He smiled easily. He bought a round of drinks for the house. The men of Colfax warmed to him immediately. He had the kind of charm that worked like good whiskey, smooth going down, pleasant in the moment, and dangerous only later when you realized how much you had consumed. He found Billy Cooper at the bar. Billy was 3 drinks in and happy to have someone paying for the 4th. Virgil asked his questions gently. About the town, the people, the ranches, the businesses. "I hear you got a lady blacksmith," Virgil said, as if it were merely an interesting bit of local color. "That is something. Not many towns can say that." Billy, loose-tongued and bitter, told him more than he should have. About Nora and her muscles and her forge. About the cowboy from Colorado who had been coming around. About the harvest dance, and the way Tyler had threatened him for speaking the truth about what Nora was. Virgil listened to all of it. His smile never wavered. But his eyes, gray and flat, were taking measurements that had nothing to do with curiosity. That evening, Virgil walked to the Henderson boarding house at the north end of the main street and asked for a room. Ruth Henderson met him in the parlor. She was a good judge of character. 30 years of living with a man who wore one face in public and another behind closed doors had given her a kind of sixth sense for deception. She could spot the gap between a man's smile and his intentions, the way a tracker could spot bent grass on a trail. Virgil Crane smiled at her over supper. He held his fork with exaggerated care. He complimented her cooking, her establishment, her taste in curtains. He asked his questions the way a man asks questions when he already knows the answers and is testing to see who will lie. "I'm looking for a man named Tyler Quinn," he said, cutting his steak into precise squares. "He is wanted in Colorado for attempted murder. Dangerous individual. I would hate for the good people of your town to be harboring him unknowingly." Ruth Henderson looked at this man across her supper table. She saw the scar running from his temple to his jaw. the pale line of it standing out against sun-darkened skin. She saw the way his charm was layered over something hard and sharp, like velvet draped over a knife. She recognized him. Not the man specifically. The type. The architecture of controlled cruelty. The smile that was not a smile. The courtesy that was not courtesy. She had seen it every day for 30 years, sitting across from her at her own table, wearing her husband's face. "I do not know anyone by that name," Ruth said. She lied. And for the first time in the story of her life, the lie was not to protect herself, but to protect someone else. The next morning, Nora went to Tyler. She found him at the Broken Creek bunkhouse cleaning tack after a long day in the saddle. He smiled when he saw her, that warm, open smile that made her feel like the sun had just come out. But the smile faded when he saw her expression. They walked away from the bunkhouse, out past the corrals, to a fence line where they could talk without being heard. The late afternoon light was golden, slanting through the pines, and somewhere in the pasture a meadowlark was singing. "We need to stop seeing each other," Nora said. Tyler's face went blank. Not angry, not hurt, just emptied out, the way a man's face goes when the blow lands before he has time to brace. "Why?" he said. She did not tell him about the ring on the anvil. She did not tell him about Virgil Crane, whose name she did not yet know, but whose presence she could feel like a shift in the weather. She told him the truth, but a different truth, the deeper one. "My mother followed my father to this town because she loved him. She gave up everything, her family, her home in the East, everything she knew. And she died here, alone, sick, in a cabin in the mountains 1,000 miles from anyone who had known her as a girl." Her voice cracked, and she hated herself for it. "If I love you and you leave, I become her. And if I love you and you stay and something happens to you, I become the reason another person I love dies in this town." She shook her head. "I cannot. I will not." Tyler was quiet for a long time. The meadowlark sang its song 3 times through before he spoke. "I understand," he said. Then he walked away. Back toward the bunkhouse, back toward the horse, back toward the life he had been building that had, in the space of 60 seconds, gone hollow. It was the right thing to say. Nora knew that. Respecting her decision, honoring her fear, not pressuring or arguing or pleading, it was exactly what a good man would do. And it felt like abandonment, because part of her, the part she was least proud of, had wanted him to fight for her. Had wanted him to say, "No, I am not leaving, I am not going anywhere, you do not get to push me away because you are scared." Had wanted him to be stronger than her fear. But he had walked away. And she let him. That night in the bunkhouse at Broken Creek, Tyler sat on his bunk in the dark. The other hands were asleep, the room filled with the sounds of snoring and shifting. He reached under the mattress and pulled out the whiskey bottle. He drank until his hands stopped shaking. Not because Nora had ended things, because she was right. He was a man with violence in his past and a warrant on his head, and a habit of numbing his pain with the same poison that had destroyed his father. What right did he have to ask anyone to share that? The bottle was half empty when he finally capped it and lay back on his bunk. He stared at the ceiling. Somewhere outside, a coyote howled long and lonesome, and the sound traveled through the mountain darkness like a question nobody could answer. In his room at the Henderson boarding house, Virgil Crane sat in a straight-backed chair beside the window, polishing his Colt .45 with a white handkerchief. The gun gleamed in the lamplight, oiled and perfect. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a photograph. It was small, no bigger than a playing card, the edges worn soft from handling. A woman's face looked back at him. Martha. Dark hair, dark eyes, a small, uncertain smile. He studied her face for a long time. His expression, for once, was not charming or calculating or cruel. It was the face of a man looking at something he had broken and could not fix. "I am going to bring you home, darling," he said to no one. soon as I finish what needs finishing." The Mustang stallion came down from the high country like a thunderstorm on four legs. Black as coal smoke, 16 hands tall, with a mane that whipped like a battle flag, and eyes that said he would kill the first man who touched him. He had been raiding Broken Creek Ranch for 2 weeks, breaking fences, scattering cattle, luring mares away from the herd with the kind of wild authority that domesticated horses found impossible to resist. Hank Morrison had lost 3 good mares already, and his patience, which was considerable, had run out. "Shoot the damn thing," Hank said at the morning meeting, standing on the porch of the ranch house with his coffee in hand. "Before it costs me the whole herd." Tyler, leaning against the corral fence with his hat pulled low, said, "Give me one chance to bring him in alive." Hank looked at him. Hank Morrison was a man who measured people the way he measured land, carefully, accurately, and without sentiment. He had hired Tyler 3 months ago on a handshake and had not regretted it once. The man worked hard, handled horses better than anyone on the payroll, and kept to himself, which was a quality Hank valued above almost all others. "One chance," Hank said. "You come back without that horse, I send Pete and a rifle." Tyler nodded. He went to the tack room and gathered rope, 2 lariats, and a long lead line. He saddled his gray gelding. And then he did something that surprised even himself. He rode south to Colfax. The forge was open, and Nora was working. She looked up when she heard his horse, and her expression went through several changes in rapid succession. Surprise, then guarded wariness, then something that might have been pain quickly locked away behind the flat, careful mask she wore for the world. "I need your help," Tyler said. He told her about the Mustang, about the broken fences and the stolen mares and Hank's ultimatum. He told her he needed someone strong enough to hold a rope against 1,000 pounds of wild horse, someone stronger than any hand on the Broken Creek payroll. "You are the only person I know who can do it," he said. Nora stood in the doorway of her forge, tongs in one hand, leather apron smudged with soot. The smart thing to do was say no. She had told him they needed to stop seeing each other. She had drawn a line and she needed to hold it. But the challenge was there, hanging in the air between them, and Nora Vaughn had never been able to walk away from something that tested her strength. It was her greatest quality and her deepest flaw, and Tyler Quinn, damn him, knew it. "When?" she said. "Dawn tomorrow." She nodded once. "I will be ready." They rode out before first light, climbing into the high country above Broken Creek, where the pine forests gave way to alpine meadows, and the air was thin and sharp enough to cut. Tyler led the way on his gelding, and Nora rode a sturdy bay mare borrowed from the ranch string, her rope coiled at her saddle horn, her hands steady on the reins. They did not talk about what had happened between them. The silence was not comfortable, but it was not hostile either. It was the silence of 2 people who had too much to say and had agreed without speaking that now was not the time. The meadow where the Mustang had last been spotted was a broad expanse of knee-high grass surrounded by granite outcrops and stands of pine. They reached it as the sun was coming over the eastern ridge and the light turned the grass to gold and the stone to copper. Tyler pointed. At the far end of the meadow, near a stand of aspens whose leaves were just beginning to turn, the Mustang stallion stood with his head up, watching them. He was magnificent, black as a moonless night, his coat gleaming in the early light. Every line of his body speaking of power and speed and a wild intelligence that had kept him alive and free in country that killed lesser animals. "He knows we are here," Tyler said quietly. "He has been watching us since the tree line," Nora said. Tyler outlined the plan. He would work from horseback, circling wide to come at the stallion from the east. Nora would position herself on foot near the granite outcrop to the south with a second rope. When Tyler got his lariat on the horse, the stallion would bolt. Tyler's gelding could hold him for a time, but not long. Nora needed to get her rope on him too, and between the 2 of them, they would bring him to a standstill. "If he charges you," Tyler said, looking at her with an expression that said he was reconsidering the entire plan, "you let go of the rope. You hear me?" Let go, and get behind the rock. I have been handling dangerous animals since I was 14, Nora said. I will hold. Nora, I will hold. Tyler bit back whatever he was going to say. He had learned, in the months he had known her, that arguing with Nora Vaughn about her own capability was like arguing with a mountain about being tall. You could state your case all day, and the mountain was not going to change its mind. He rode wide, keeping to the tree line, working his way around to the east side of the meadow. The Mustang watched him, head high, ears pricked forward. It knew what a man on horseback with a rope meant. It had been chased before. Nora climbed to a position behind the granite outcrop, coiling her rope, testing her footing. The ground was solid here, packed earth and rock. Good purchase. She braced herself and waited. Tyler broke from the tree line at a run. The gelding leaped forward and Tyler's arm was already moving, the lariat spinning in a wide loop above his head. The Mustang wheeled, but Tyler had the angle and the rope sailed true, settling around the stallion's neck and snapping tight. What happened next was like trying to hold a bolt of lightning. The stallion screamed. There was no other word for it. A sound that was part rage and part terror, a sound that bounced off the granite walls and echoed through the meadow like thunder. The horse lunged against the rope with all of its considerable strength, and Tyler's gelding was dragged sideways, hooves plowing furrows in the meadow grass. Nora stepped out from behind the rock and threw her rope. Her aim was good. The loop caught the stallion around the neck, and she dug her boots into the earth and hauled back with everything she had. Every muscle in her body screamed. The hemp burned through her gloves. The stallion dragged her forward 1 foot, 2 feet, 5 feet, 10 feet, her boots carving trenches in the dirt. Her shoulder hit the granite outcrop. She braced against it and held. The stallion fought. God, how it fought. Rearing, kicking, throwing its head. Every movement a declaration that it would not be taken, would not be tamed, would not bend to any will but its own. The rope in Nora's hands hummed with the force of it, vibrating like a plucked bowstring. Tyler was off his horse now, working his way hand over hand down his rope toward the stallion's head. His voice was low and steady, the same voice he used on frightened colts, on spooked cattle, on anything wild and dangerous that needed to be convinced the world was not going to end. Easy now. Easy. You are all right. Nobody is going to hurt you. You are all right. The stallion trembled. Its sides heaved. Its eyes were white-rimmed and wild. But Tyler kept coming, kept talking, and slowly, painfully, the fight began to drain out of the animal. Not surrender. Something closer to acceptance. The understanding shared between two creatures who were both more wild than tame, that the fighting was over. Nora held her rope until her arms shook and her palms were raw and bleeding through the gloves. She held it until Tyler had both hands on the stallion's halter and the horse's head was down and its breathing had slowed. She held it until it was safe, and then she leaned against the granite outcrop and let her arms fall to her sides. Tyler was breathing as hard as the horse. He looked at Nora across 20 feet of chewed-up meadow, both of them covered in dirt and sweat, rope burned and shaking. "I told you I would hold," Nora said. Tyler laughed. It was a raw, exhausted sound, but it was real. They sat in the meadow afterward while the stallion, now hobbled and tied to a sturdy pine, stood with its head down, breathing quietly. The morning sun was warm on their faces. The mountains rose around them in every direction, granite and pine and sky. Nora looked at her hands. The rope burns crossed her palms in angry red lines, matching the calluses that were already there. "I am terrified," she said. Tyler looked at her. "Of the horse?" "No. Of this, of you, of wanting something I might lose." The words hung in the clear mountain air. Tyler was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was steady but not certain. "I am terrified too, every day. But I would rather be scared with you than safe without you." Nora did not take him back. She did not undo what she had said days earlier. But she did not send him away. The door that she had tried to close was open again, barely, painfully, and they both knew it. They brought the Mustang down the mountain together. It was slow work, the horse fighting every step, but by afternoon they were on the road to Colfax, and the stallion had settled into a sullen walk between them. As they rode into the outskirts of town, Nora saw a man standing outside the saloon. He was well-dressed, dark coat, new hat, a scar running from his temple to his jaw. He was watching them ride in with an expression of polite interest. He tipped his hat to Nora, smiled. The hair rose on the back of her neck. She did not know why, and she did not ask Tyler about it. But something about that smile was wrong. It was the smile of a man who knew something you did not, and enjoyed the knowing. That evening, Sarah Jane came to the forge. She was holding a letter. "This came on the afternoon mail," she said, handing it to Nora. "From Silver Falls, Colorado." Nora opened the letter with hands that still bore the rope burns from the morning. She read it twice. Then she sat down on the bench and read it again. The letter was from the county clerk in Silver Falls. Martha Crane had filed for divorce and received it. She had relocated to Denver, and she had written to the county sheriff, testifying that her husband, Virgil Crane, had attacked her first on the night in question, and that Tyler Quinn had acted in her defense. The sheriff had reviewed the case. The warrant for Tyler Quinn had been vacated. He was a free man. Nora reread the last line 3 times to make sure she was not imagining it. Then she folded the letter and pressed it against her chest. Tyler was free. The law was no longer hunting him. But as she sat there in the quiet of her forge, holding the letter that should have made everything simple, Nora thought of the man outside the saloon, the scar, the smile, the tip of the hat. If the warrant was gone, then whoever was hunting Tyler was not doing it for the law. He was doing it for something else entirely. At the saloon, Virgil Crane sat by the window, watching the forge at the end of the street. He had seen them ride in together, the blacksmith woman and Tyler Quinn, side by side on the mountain road with a wild Mustang between them. He had watched the way they moved in tandem, the way they looked at each other when they thought the other was not watching. He smiled. It was the smile of a man watching a trap, close, slow, satisfied, and utterly without mercy. The fire in Nora's forge flared wrong at midnight. Not the steady glow of banked coals, but the roaring, hungry orange of kerosene poured through a crack in the wall. Nora woke to the smell of smoke. She was out of bed before her mind was fully awake, her body responding to the ancient animal instinct that said fire and danger and move. Through the cabin window, she could see the forge lit up from inside. Orange light pouring from the doorway and the gaps in the wooden walls like blood from a wound. She ran, barefoot, wearing only her nightgown, across the yard and into the heat. The fire had caught the east wall where the firewood was stacked, and was climbing fast, eating the dry timber with a speed that told her this was no accident. She could smell the kerosene, sharp and chemical, underneath the wood smoke. Nora did not stop to think. She grabbed the first water bucket, already filled from the evening's work, and hurled it at the base of the flames. Steam hissed and rose. She grabbed the second bucket, threw it, grabbed the barrel tap, and dragged it open, filling the buckets as fast as the water would flow. The fire was spreading. The wall crackled and popped, sending sparks showering across the forge floor toward the coal bin. If the coal caught, the whole building would go. Nora seized the anvil's iron handle and dragged it away from the flames, her muscles straining against 300 pounds of cast iron. She pulled the bellows free, but the leather was already blackening. She beat at the flames with wet blankets, standing so close that the heat blistered the skin on her arms and singed the ends of her hair. Her strength saved the forge. Not the building, which was half destroyed by the time the fire burned itself out, but the tools, the anvil, the metalworking supplies that were her livelihood, those she pulled clear. She hauled them into the yard, bucket by bucket, armload by armload, working alone in the dark while the fire roared and the building groaned. and the night pressed in around her like a living thing. By the time the flames died to embers and the structure stood skeletal against the pre-dawn sky, Nora was sitting in the dirt among her salvaged tools, hands blistered, face black with soot, her nightgown torn and filthy. The bellows were destroyed. Half the roof had collapsed. The west wall leaned at an angle that said it would not stand much longer. But the anvil was intact. The hammers were intact. The tongs and files and rasps, the stock iron and the horseshoe blanks, those she had saved. She sat there in the wreckage of everything her father had built, everything she had fought to maintain, and she did not cry. Not because she had trained herself out of it, because she was too angry. Tyler arrived at sunrise. Nora heard his horse before she saw him, the familiar rhythm of the gray gelding's hooves on the road. He came around the bend and pulled up short when he saw the ruins. He was off his horse and beside her in seconds. But the first thing Nora noticed, the first thing her keen senses registered before she even looked at his face, was the smell. Whiskey. Not stale, not faint. Fresh. The smell of a man who had been drinking through the night and had ridden hard to burn it off. Tyler saw the destruction, saw her blistered hands, her singed hair, her soot-blackened face. He smelled the kerosene that still hung in the air, and she watched him put it together, the realization moving across his face like a cloud shadow crossing a field. Someone had done this. Someone had attacked her, and he had not been there. "Nora, he started. She cut him off. Her voice was flat and cold, colder than he had ever heard it. "My father worked himself to death because he did not trust me to be strong enough. I will not stand by and watch another man She stopped, swallowed, would not say the word, not to a man who smelled like whiskey at 7 in the morning. "Another man I care about destroy himself the same way, just with a different poison." Tyler closed his mouth. He did not defend himself, did not explain or excuse or justify. He simply took off his hat, set it on the ground, rolled up his sleeves, and started clearing wreckage. They worked side by side all day without speaking. Tyler hauled charred timbers. Nora sorted salvageable tools from ruined ones. The sun climbed and the temperature rose and the sweat replaced the whiskey smell on Tyler's skin, until by afternoon he smelled only of ash and honest labor. He did not ask for water. He did not take a break. He worked with the grim, silent determination of a man trying to balance a debt he knew he could never fully pay. That afternoon, Virgil Crane appeared on the main street of Colfax. Tyler was walking from the general store where he had gone to buy nails for the temporary repairs when Virgil stepped out of the saloon doorway directly into his path. Close enough to touch. Close enough that Tyler could see every detail of the scar that ran from temple to jaw. The scar his own fist had put there. Virgil smiled, pleasant as a Sunday morning. "Martha sends her regards," he said. Then he turned and walked away. Tyler's entire body went rigid. The bag of nails in his left hand crumpled as his fist clenched. His right hand dropped to his hip, to the gun belt he was wearing, and stayed there. His vision narrowed to a tunnel with Virgil Crane's retreating back at the center of it. He did not draw, but it took everything in him. Every ounce of control he had built over 3 years of running and hiding and trying to be something other than his father's son. Virgil did not look back. He did not need to. He knew exactly what Tyler was doing behind him. He had planned it. That night, Billy Cooper came to the forge. Nora was working by lantern light, sorting tools and scraping soot from the surfaces that had survived the fire. She heard boots on the path and her hand closed around a hammer before she recognized the shape in the doorway. Billy Cooper stood there, sober. He was pale and his hands were twisting the brim of his hat into a shape that would never recover. "Miss Vaughn," he said, "I need to tell you something." Nora did not invite him in. She stood with the hammer in her hand and waited. "That man, Crane, the one staying at Henderson's, he bought me drinks, more than once." And I'm a fool when I drink, which is most of the time. And I told him things. About you and Quinn. About the forge. About the dance. Billy's voice cracked. I think he is the one who burned your shop. Nora's grip tightened on the hammer. Billy went on. He has a plan. He told me, though I do not think he meant to, or maybe he did because he is the kind of man who likes people to know how clever he is. He is going to push Quinn until Quinn draws on him. Force him into a fight, public, where everyone can see. And when Quinn pulls his gun first, Crane will shoot him dead and call it self-defense. Billy swallowed hard. Legal as Sunday church. The night air was cold on Nora's bare arms. She could feel the blisters on her palms throbbing. I ain't a good man, Miss Vaughn, Billy said. But I ain't a murderer's helper, neither. He left without waiting for a response, walking fast into the dark, like a man who had said his piece and wanted to be gone before the consequences arrived. Nora stood in the ruins of her forge, holding the hammer, thinking. Then she went to find Tyler. She found him at Broken Creek, sitting on the corral fence in the dark, his hands hanging between his knees. He looked up when she approached, and his face was drawn and tired and older than his 26 years. If he wants you to lose control, Nora said without preamble, then we do not give him the satisfaction. You understand me. No guns, no fists. We beat him by not becoming what he wants us to be. Tyler was quiet for a moment. Then, and if he comes after you? Then I will handle it. I have been handling things alone my whole life. The words landed. She saw them hit. Tyler flinched, not from anger, but from the truth of it. She had been alone when the forge burned. She had fought the fire alone, saved her tools alone, sat in the wreckage alone. And he had been in the saloon with a bottle. I know, he said. I know I was not there. I know what that means. Good, Nora said. Her voice was not gentle. Then be there next time. She turned and walked away. Behind her, Tyler sat on the fence and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. Something was breaking inside him, something that needed to break, the way a bone sometimes has to be re-broken before it can set straight. 3 days later, Earl Henderson died. Heart failure, or the liquor, or both. The details did not matter much. He was buried in the small cemetery on the hill above town, and Ruth Henderson stood at the graveside in black, dry-eyed, her face carved from something harder than stone. After the funeral, she came to the forge. The repairs were underway, Tyler and several Broken Creek hands having spent the weekend framing new walls. Ruth walked through the construction without commenting on it, and found Nora at the anvil, which she had set up under a canvas awning to keep working while the building was restored. I need a new lock, Ruth said, for the boarding house door. Nora nodded. I can have it done by Thursday. Ruth reached into her purse for payment. As she extended her hand, the sleeve of her morning dress rode up. Nora saw the bruises, old ones, yellowed and faded, layered over older ones that were barely visible at all. A record written on skin, spanning more time than Nora had been alive. Their eyes met. Neither spoke. But in that silence, something shifted between them. The distance that had separated them for years, the judgment, the contempt, the cold shoulders and cutting words, all of it suddenly had a different shape. Ruth Henderson had not hated Nora's strength. She had envied it. And the envy had curdled into cruelty because it was easier to punish someone for having what you lacked than to face the fact that you had never fought for it yourself. Ruth pulled her sleeve down. Thursday, then, she said, and left. That night, Nora went back into the half-rebuilt forge alone. She stoked the fire, she heated iron, but she was not making a lock, and she was not making horseshoes. The fire reflected in her green eyes as she worked, and for the first time in years, the strength in her arms did not feel like a burden or a curse or a mark of shame. It felt like a weapon, and she intended to use it. The last morning before everything changed, Colfax woke under a fog so thick it swallowed the main street whole, as if even God did not want to see what was coming. Nora was at the forge early. The new walls were up, but the roof was still canvas, and the fog crept in around the edges, turning the air inside to something damp and gray. She had the fire going, the coals glowing cherry red, and she was working on a set of hinges when she heard boots on the packed earth outside. Virgil Crane stepped through the doorway. He was alone. Dressed well, as always, the dark coat and new hat, the gun belt polished to a shine. The scar on his face stood out in the dim light, a pale line running from temple to jaw. He removed his hat as he entered, the gesture of a gentleman, and smiled. "Morning, Miss Vaughn. I was hoping you might be open for business." Nora set down her hammer. She did not return the smile. "What do you need?" "A knife. Something sturdy. Good steel." He walked along the workbench, running his fingers over the tools with the casual familiarity of a man who felt entitled to touch whatever he pleased. "I have heard you do fine work. Best in the region, they say." "I do honest work," Nora said. "Tell me what you need the knife for, and I will tell you what it will cost." Virgil stopped at the end of the bench and turned to face her. The smile was still there, but something behind it had shifted. A hardness in the eyes, a tightness around the mouth. "You have got strong hands, Miss Vaughn," he said. "I have been watching you work. Impressive for a woman." He paused. "I wonder if they are strong enough to hold on to the things you care about." Nora met his gaze, held it. She had spent 22 years being looked at by people who wanted her to be smaller, quieter, less than she was. Virgil Crane, for all his scar and his gun and his dangerous charm, was just another man who thought he could make her flinch. "I hammer iron into whatever shape I want," Nora said. "Men are not much different." The smile froze on Virgil's face. For a moment, just a moment, something raw showed through the polish. He was not used to women who did not back down. Martha had backed down. Every woman he had ever known had backed down. It was the natural order of things, in his understanding. "That is quite a claim," he said. His voice had lost its music. "It is not a claim. It is a fact." Virgil stepped closer. Close enough that Nora could smell his shaving soap and the gun oil on his hands. Close enough that she could see the individual threads of the scar tissue on his face. "Let me tell you something, Miss Vaughn. The man you have been keeping company with, Tyler Quinn, he is not what you think he is. He is a violent criminal who beat me within an inch of my life and left me to die in my own home. He is dangerous, and anyone who stands near a dangerous man is liable to catch what is coming to him." "I know exactly what Tyler Quinn did," Nora said, "and I know why he did it." Something snapped behind Virgil's eyes. The last thin layer of charm cracked and fell away, and what was underneath was not charming at all. His hand shot out and closed around Nora's wrist like a vice. "You do not know anything," he hissed. Nora did not pull away. She did not flinch. She did not scream. She reached behind her with her free hand, picked up the smithing tongs from the bench, and clamped them around Virgil's forearm. Then she twisted. Virgil screamed. The sound tore out of him, ugly and involuntary, and he released her wrist and stumbled backward, cradling his arm. The tongs had left a mark that would purple and swell for weeks. "Do not touch me," Nora said. "Do not ever touch me." Virgil was breathing hard, his face contorted with pain and something worse. Humiliation. A woman had hurt him. Again, somehow a woman was at the center of his pain, and the symmetry of it, Martha and now Nora, was driving him toward a place from which there was no coming back. "You are going to regret that," he said through his teeth. "I have regretted a lot of things in my life, Mr. Crane. That is not going to be one of them." That was when Tyler arrived. He came around the corner of the forge at a run, drawn by the sound of Virgil's scream. He took in the scene in one sweep, Virgil clutching his arm, Nora holding the tongs, the dangerous electricity in the air, and the old darkness surged up in him like a wave. He drew his gun. The click of the hammer cocking was very loud in the fog-quiet morning. "Step away from her," Tyler said. Virgil straightened up. The pain in his arm was still there, but now there was something else on his face. Satisfaction. The plan was working. "There it is," Virgil said. He smiled through the pain, blood in his teeth from where he had bitten his tongue. "Go on, Quinn. Pull that trigger where the whole town can see. Give me what I came for." People were gathering. The sound of the scream and then the gun being cocked had drawn them from the saloon, from the general store, from the houses along the main street. They came through the fog like ghosts, faces pale and uncertain, forming a semicircle around the forge. Tyler's hand was steady on the gun. His eyes were locked on Virgil. Every muscle in his body was coiled and ready. This was the moment. This was the edge he had been running from for 3 years, the line between the man he wanted to be and the man his father had been. Nora moved. She did not step between Tyler and Virgil. She turned her back on Virgil completely as if he did not exist and faced Tyler. She walked forward until she was close enough to touch him, and she placed her hand flat on his chest, over his heart. She could feel it hammering beneath her palm, fast and hard. "Put it down," she said. Quiet. Only for him. "You are not your father. You are not what he made you." She pressed her hand harder against his chest, feeling the heartbeat, holding it. "Put it down." Tyler looked at her hand, then at her face. Green eyes, steady as iron. The same eyes that had met his without flinching the first morning he rode into Colfax. The same eyes that had watched him in the ember light when he told her about Martha Crane. The same eyes that had held his across 20 feet of chewed-up meadow while she held a wild stallion on a rope. He lowered the gun. The crowd murmured. Virgil's smile faltered. And then Ruth Henderson stepped forward. She came out of the crowd slowly, a small woman in a black morning dress, her face pale but her jaw set. She walked into the space between the men with the careful steps of someone who has made a decision that cannot be taken back. "I know what kind of man you are, Mr. Crane." Her voice shook, but it carried. It carried across the fog-shrouded street and into the ears of every person standing there. "My husband was the same kind, smiling in public, breaking bones behind closed doors." She turned to the crowd. Her hands went to the collar of her dress, that high collar she had worn every day for 30 years, summer and winter, rain and shine. She unfastened the top button, then the next, then the third. She pulled the collar down. The bruises on her neck were old, yellowed and layered, some faded to the color of dirty water, some still carrying the shadow of the hand that had made them. They mapped her neck and throat like a topography of silence, 30 years of being hit and hiding it. No one in the crowd moved. "Tyler Quinn beat this man because this man was beating his wife," Ruth said. Her voice was stronger now, as if the act of showing the bruises had released something that had been clamped down for decades. "The warrant has been dropped. His wife saw to that herself. This man has no legal claim, no authority. He is just a bully who is angry his wife had the sense to leave him." The crowd shifted. The murmurs became voices, became something louder. Hank Morrison stepped forward from the back of the crowd. He was a big man, and when he spoke, people listened. "Crane," he said, "you have got 1 hour to clear out of Colfax. If I see you on Broken Creek land, I will treat it as trespassing. And in this county, that is a shooting matter." The ranch hands from Broken Creek moved up behind him. 4 of them, then 6, then 8, standing in a line that was not threatening exactly, but was very, very clear. Virgil Crane looked around. For the first time, the mask slipped entirely. He was alone. There was no one in this crowd who would stand with him, no one who believed his story, no one who cared. His hand went to his vest pocket. Involuntary. The pocket where he kept Martha's photograph. For 1 second, his face showed something that was not rage or cruelty or calculation. It was grief. Raw, ugly grief. The kind that comes from losing something you destroyed with your own hands and never understanding that you were the one who broke it. Then the mask came back. He mounted his horse, spat in the dirt. "This is not finished," he said. "Yes, it is," Hank Morrison said. Virgil Crane rode east, out of Colfax, through the thinning fog and into the morning light. He did not look back. Tyler stood in the middle of the main street. His gun was holstered, his hands were empty. He was shaking from head to foot. Nora took his hand. "You saved me," he whispered. "We saved each other," she said. The crowd began to disperse. Some people clapped Tyler on the shoulder as they passed. Others nodded to Nora with a respect that had not been there before. Sarah Jane appeared from somewhere and hugged Nora so hard it hurt. Ruth Henderson stood alone by the forge. Nora walked over to her. "Mrs. Henderson." Ruth looked at her. Her collar was still open. She had not buttoned it back up. "Thank you," Nora said. "What you did took more courage than anything I have ever seen." Ruth's jaw tightened. She nodded once, turned and walked away. That night, Nora sat in her cabin alone. Tyler had gone back to Broken Creek. The town was quiet. The fog had burned off during the day and the stars were out now, bright and thick over the mountains. She cried. For the first time in 2 years, she cried. Not from pain or anger or frustration, from relief. From the cracking open of something that had been sealed shut inside her for so long she had forgotten it was there. She cried for her father, who had died trying to protect her because he did not believe she was strong enough. She cried for her mother, who had died alone in a cabin 1,000 miles from home. She cried for the girl she had been, the girl who had looked in the mirror and seen something wrong, something broken, something the world would never want. And she cried for the woman she was now, strong enough to stand between 2 armed men, strong enough to choose love over fear, strong enough to finally let someone in. At Broken Creek, Tyler sat on his bunk. He looked at the whiskey bottle under his mattress, looked at it for a long time. Then he picked it up, walked outside, and poured it into the dirt. Nobody saw him do it. That was all right. Some things did not need witnesses. He stood in the dark, holding the empty bottle, listening to the night sounds of the ranch. Horses moving in the corral, crickets singing in the grass, the creek running over rocks steady and unstoppable. He set the bottle on the fence post and walked back inside, lay down on his bunk. And for the first time in 3 years, Tyler Quinn slept without dreaming. The new forge smelled of fresh-cut timber and possibility. Tyler had rebuilt it twice as wide as the original, and Nora did not understand why until she saw the second anvil. "What is that for?" she said, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed. Tyler set the anvil on its stump and straightened up. He was sweating. His shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, sawdust in his hair. He had been working on the rebuild every morning before dawn, and every evening after his day at Broken Creek, and the results showed. New walls of sugar pine, tight-jointed and solid. A proper stone chimney for the forge fire. A roof that would hold against the mountain winters. "Every good forge needs a second anvil," he said, "for when you take on an apprentice." Nora looked at the second anvil, then at Tyler, then at the forge he had built around her, the space he had created for her work and her future, bigger than what she'd had before. Not because he wanted to change what she did, but because he wanted her to have room to grow. The town helped with the rebuild, and their help told the story of everything that had changed better than words ever could. Wilson hauled lumber in his wagon. Pete Garza and the Broken Creek hands spent 2 Saturdays raising the roof beams, and Tyler worked alongside them. Sarah Jane sewed curtains for the new windows, a small feminine touch that Nora would never have thought of and was surprised to find she liked. Billy Cooper showed up on the second Saturday. He did not announce himself, did not ask if he was welcome, just picked up a hammer and started driving nails. He worked all day without meeting anyone's eyes and left at sundown without a word. But his nails were straight and his joints were tight, and Nora noted it. Ruth Henderson came on a Tuesday afternoon. She walked through the construction without commenting on it and set a copper kettle on the workbench. It was old and dented and well used, the kind of kettle that had seen decades of service. "For coffee," she said. "A smith needs coffee." She turned to leave. Nora said, "Mrs. Henderson?" Ruth stopped but did not turn around. "Thank you for what you did." Ruth's shoulders tightened. She stood very still for a moment. Then she nodded once sharply, the way a soldier acknowledges an order, and walked out. That was all. No tearful reconciliation, no speeches. Just two women who understood what it cost to be strong in a world that made you pay for it. Tyler's redemption was not a single moment. It was a process, daily and deliberate. Each day, a small choice that added up to something larger. He was at the forge before dawn, at Broken Creek during the day, back at the forge by evening. He did not drink. He did not talk about not drinking. He just showed up every day, steady and reliable as the sunrise. Nora watched him and saw the effort behind the steadiness. She saw the way his eyes lingered on the saloon door when he walked past it, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides when something frustrated him, reaching for a comfort he had denied himself. She saw the battle, and she respected it by not commenting on it. Instead, she started leaving a cup of coffee out for him on the workbench each morning, brewed in Ruth Henderson's copper kettle. Tyler never mentioned it. He just drank it. And that quiet exchange, the coffee and the silence, said more than any conversation could have. On a Thursday evening in late October, they were working together on the new bellows. Both of them were filthy, covered in ash and sweat and the grime of honest labor. The setting sun was streaming through the forge doors, painting everything in shades of gold. Tyler stopped working. He looked at Nora. "I want to wake up every morning to the sound of your hammer," he said. "Will you marry me?" Nora set down the leather she had been stitching. She looked at Tyler Quinn, covered in soot, his hair sticking up at odd angles, his hands rough and calloused and steady. She did not answer immediately. "If we have a daughter someday," she said, "and she is strong like me, shoulders like mine, arms like mine, what will you tell her?" Tyler did not hesitate, not for a heartbeat. "I will tell her she is her mother's girl, and that is the best thing she could ever be." Nora smiled. Tyler had told her once that her smile was like sunrise. She had not believed him at the time. But looking at his face now, at the way it lit up when she smiled, she thought maybe he had been telling the truth. "Then yes," she said, "I will marry you." She paused. "But I am not giving up the forge." Tyler laughed, that warm, real laugh that she had heard for the first time in a mountain meadow with a wild stallion between them. "I will never ask you to give up the thing that makes you who you are." They were married in November in the church that had finally gotten its roof. It was a small ceremony. Sarah Jane stood as bridesmaid, wearing a dress she had made herself. Hank Morrison stood as best man, looking uncomfortable in a suit but standing straight and steady beside Tyler the way he stood beside everything he believed in. Ruth Henderson sat in the back row. She cried. Nobody asked why. Nobody needed to. The winter came and went. Tyler worked Broken Creek by day and came home to the expanded cabin every evening. Nora ran the forge, and the work was better than ever. Her reputation had spread since the confrontation with Virgil Crane, not because of the drama itself, but because the story had put her name in mouths that had never spoken it before. People came from 20 miles away for her horseshoes, 30 miles for her wagon repairs. A wealthy rancher from Sacramento commissioned a full set of decorative hinges for his new barn doors. Spring arrived with the suddenness that mountain springs always did, the snow retreating up the peaks overnight, and the meadows exploding with wildflowers in colors so vivid they looked painted on. Nora knew she was carrying their first child. She had known for weeks, but had not told Tyler yet. She was waiting for the right moment. though she could not have said what the right moment would look like. She was standing in the forge doorway one evening, watching the sunset paint the Sierra Nevada peaks in shades of rose and gold. When she heard a knock on the frame behind her, she turned. A girl stood there. Maybe 15 years old, though it was hard to tell. She was tall for her age, broad through the shoulders, with hands that were too big for her wrists and arms that strained the seams of a dress that did not fit right. Her eyes were red. She had been crying. "Ma'am," the girl said, "I heard there is a woman blacksmith in Colfax. I was wondering if you would be willing to teach me the trade." Nora looked at this girl and felt the years fold over on themselves like heated iron. She saw herself at 15, the same broad shoulders, the same two big hands, the same desperate, aching wish to be something the world kept telling her she could not be. "Why do you want to learn?" Nora asked. The girl's chin lifted. "Because I am strong. And people in my town say that is ugly on a girl. But I do not think it is ugly. I think it is useful. And I heard you think so too." Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she walked to the tool rack and selected the smallest hammer there, a 2-pound crosspeen that her father had given her when she was 12 years old, the first hammer she had ever held. She held it out to the girl. "Start with this one," she said. "When it feels too light, I will give you a heavier one." The girl took the hammer. Her face changed. The redness around her eyes was still there. But something new was showing through it. A spark. The first fragile flame of hope catching on dry kindling. She turned to hang her coat on the hook by the door. And as she did, the collar fell open, and Nora saw a name stitched inside in careful thread. Crane. Nora stopped breathing. 1 heartbeat. 2. The girl did not notice. She was already looking at the anvil, at the forge fire, at the tools hanging on the wall, with the wide-eyed wonder of someone seeing for the first time the place where they were meant to be. Nora closed her eyes, opened them. The past was the past. Iron did not care whose hands had shaped it before. It only cared about the hands that held it now. She picked up her own hammer. The 4-pound hammer, the one her father had used, the one that had shaped 10,000 horseshoes and wagon parts and gate hinges and every piece of ironwork in Colfax that was worth a damn. The handle was smooth from years of use, worn to fit the exact shape of her palm. "Come on then," Nora said. "There is iron to work." The girl took her place at the second anvil, the one Tyler had set there for exactly this purpose. Nora placed a piece of heated iron on the girl's anvil and showed her where to strike. "Like this," Nora said, and brought her hammer down. The ring of iron filled the forge and rolled out through the open doors, across the yard, down the main street of Colfax. The girl lifted her hammer, brought it down. 2 strikes rang out as one. The sound traveled across the valley floor, up the granite face of the mountains, and bounced off the peaks that had stood there for 10,000 years, and would stand for 10,000 more. And the mountains sent it back. Outside, the last light of the day was fading from the sky. The forge glowed warm and orange in the gathering dusk, a beacon at the end of the street, steady as a heartbeat. Tyler's horse was tied at the hitching post, and through the window of the cabin, a lamp was already lit, waiting for the end of the workday and the beginning of the evening. Nora Vaughn Quinn brought her hammer down on the iron, and the iron sang. She was strong, she was beautiful, and she was exactly where she was meant to be.